Well, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out on a fairly blustery January night, and always slightly surprises me when people turn up to listen to me, but there we are. You'll find also that it's not so much a recital as more making it up as I go along. So this is sort of an interactive session, so if I'm not making something clear, or if there's something you want to ask, then I'll do my best to try and answer it. I'd like to start by taking a little bit of a step back in time. 1990 was when I first started working with Martin Ebert, and for 15 years we worked together in our old practice, and in 2005 when we were setting up Mackenzie & Ebert, we sat down in a pub with a beer and sort of had a bit of a reflection on what we'd done. And at this stage we'd been really immersed in the classic courses of Britain, Ireland, and across Europe, and it'd been an amazing journey up to that point. But we said to ourselves, we were trying to make our own names from that point onwards, and we said, well, what can we do better? What aren't we comfortable with about going to these great old clubs? And we both were sort of united in feeling that we never felt well enough informed when we were going in to make recommendations about these great old courses, and we concluded that the way that we could improve our method of operation was to really try and become the market leader in terms of doing historic research about how the courses evolved, and David alluded to that, and we work really, really hard on doing it. And the reason that we do it is because we want to really get to grips with why courses have changed, how much they've changed, at what period they changed, what were the reasons why they changed, was there a rationale, so that when we start to make general recommendations or looking at strengths and weaknesses, for instance, we have that knowledge of the history to underpin that. So the first part of tonight's talk is going to be what we found about your lovely old club, which I think is quite an interesting story. As with many research studies, though, the conclusions aren't always as clear cut as you would like them to be, and there are a few question marks, there's a few sort of mystery aspects to it. But I think what we have done, though, is gathered a huge amount of information and made a fair amount of sense of it. And there may well be some people here tonight who might be able to fill in a few of the gaps, in which case you'll let me know or let David know. So what did we find? We found in here in the archive material, and I say we, but David and his committee have done a huge amount of work, which they were very good to feed through. This is a receipt from Alistair Mackenzie, who is one of the great names in golf course architecture. Brochures which highlight that Ilkley was one of the courses that he was advising, and not only was he advising it, but he was actually pinpointing it in his brochure when he set up in business on his own as well. So really fascinating archive material. A really important document for us is the golf handbook for the club that dates back to 1931, and you may not be able to see down the bottom. It was written by Bernard Darwin, and these sort of booklets are the equivalent of websites today. It was the club's way of promoting themselves. If people were interested in coming, then the Royal Mail would bring one of these booklets to you to see if it was of interest. And of course, because Bernard Darwin wrote for it, he may well be the greatest ever golf writer that I know, and it was drummed into me as I was learning from Donald Seale that if Bernard Darwin wrote something, it was always well researched, and it was always accurate, and it was always highly respected as well. He really was one of the absolute greats. So these are some of the quotes that we unearthed. We'll come across some of them later on, but he was very complimentary about about what he found. And the interesting thing was that he was coming along 3-4 years after Alistair Mackenzie did one of the big rounds of work on the course. So he's actually describing in quite significant detail work on holes like the 13th and the 14th and the 15th. And it really helps to fill in a lot of the gaps. There's another really interesting map that we found. You probably may not have looked at it very much on the clubhouse wall, and it's the 1926 map. And at first glance you think, well, it's going to be of limited value because the greens are just blobs with numbers in the middle of them, and it can't really be to scale. And yet it's got a scale running along the bottom of it. So one of the things that we're able to do in this sort of digital age is to import it into AutoCAD and do a bit of fiddling around with it to scale it, which then allows us to compare it with later photographs, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. Oops, sorry. So again, with David's great research, we were able to uncover or to look at more detail. This was the 6th tee shot. I'm not sure about the exact date, probably the 1920s. No trees along the river edge, and altogether different view of the river and the way the hole played until the trees were cleared. So I'm sure there will have been resistance amongst some of you for the tree clearance along the 6th, but the tree growth was a sort of relatively temporary or modern phenomenon. Gets a little bit more interesting, and I do apologise, I am a bit of an anorak. This is from the 1931 handbook, 13th hole, 2 bunkers on the right, 2 little pot bunkers down short of the bunkers on the right, and a bunker on the left, and the green you can see fairly clearly that it's angled. 1931 again, this is the 15th hole, massive bunkers right up on the side of the hill, set into the steep slope on the right. But you can see it's how much things have changed from then to now. And the idea of these historical studies is not to be judgmental. All I'm saying to you is, as a fact, in 1930, that's what the 13th hole looks like, 15th hole, sorry. You know that it's no longer like that. Therefore, we know that something's changed, and try to work out why it's changed, and whether there's a case for taking a step back in time or using that as a sort of an influence for going forward. So there's 1931, the 13th green. There's what it changed to by the time you get to the 1940s. So you can see that there's a big cross bunker right across the front of the green. There's 1 bunker on the right, the 2 little pot bunkers have disappeared. There's a little pot bunker over the back of the green. So even with a world war in between and only sort of 17, 18 years, really significant changes occurred. The 14th is another interesting example with some good photography of the green. You can see how far the green extended out at the front, and a glimpse of the bunker there, and we know from other photographs that the bunker extended basically the entire length of the green. It may have been 2, it may have been 1, we're not entirely sure. And you can see the bunkers just extending up, and the people, there's a glimpse of the bunker there, and the little nib of the green poking out on the right hand side. So you can tell from these photos that the 14th sort of been smoothed off and rounded off quite a lot, and we also know that the character of how the hole plays has changed as well. That's looking down on the 15th green. You can see there's quite a sharp step in the green as well. We also found some oblique aerial photography, which was interesting, but probably didn't help to fill in too many of the gaps. So get back to the aerial photography. So we would normally do the search ourselves, but David and the committee were sort of 1 step ahead of us, and we sourced photographs from 1948, 1965, 1989, and I mentioned earlier about the 1926 plan. So we scaled the 1926 plan and distorted it to try and sit as comfortably on top of the 1948 aerial as we could, to try and work out how accurate that 1926 plan was. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. What's interesting is you can see almost no tree growth whatsoever in 1948. Even by 1965 there's not a huge amount. When you zoom in you can just start to see the beginnings of tree plantations growing up, but there's the fourth hole there, hardly a tree in sight down the side of the fourth. I'll show you that in a bit more detail later on. By the time you get to 1989 you can really see the impact the trees are having, and coming into the present day, what a stark contrast there is from 1948. And again, there's nothing judgmental about that, it's a statement of fact. You've gone from being almost entirely treeless in 1948 to close to being tree-lined in 2018. So I won't go through every single hole because it takes a long time to do that, and it probably isn't all that exciting. But I'll give you a few examples though. The 12th hole I think is an interesting one. This is the 1926 plan, and it took us a while to sort of tune in to what the graphics meant, that you've got these sort of green blobs and other sort of green slivers, but they've got sand set into them as well. And it's very odd graphics because it sort of suggests that the bunkers are behind the ridges, but I don't think that can actually be the case. I think there's a bit of artistic license. And there is a theory that, or a probability, that the 26 plan was drawn up as a way of trying to describe some of Dr. Alistair Mackenzie's work that was just about to take place, because some of the holes it appears very accurate, and other holes it sort of deviates from what actually appears in the 1931 handbook. So what we try to do is work out what features of those two bunkers there probably tally with that bunker. Those three there may well be something to do with that, extending over towards the fourth. That hump there, or possibly that one, tallies in with that. So again, we're just trying to work out what could be original features and what's changed, and always referring back to the present day. And moving on, you can see how bunkers are starting to reduce in size, positions change, and they start to get filled in by 1989. Bunker sizes, green sizes, all start to change quite significantly. So it's really a very clear picture starting to emerge of a course which has been in a constant state of change. You're not playing golf in a time capsule. Sometimes you go along and it's remarkable how much has remained untouched, but that isn't the case here. I mentioned the 13th hole. I mentioned that I tend to get a bit ahead of myself. So there's the 1926 plan, and there's the two bunkers there and the bunker on the left. So you can see there's a real similarity with the graphics of the plan there, and then by 1948 there's the huge cross bunker and the bunker over the back, and there it is there in the 1948 photograph. But by the time you get to actually I'm looking backwards, sorry. And then by the time you get to the 1960s, the cross bunkers disappeared again. There's a huge bunker running all the way down the left-hand side. And then by 1989, that bunker's disappeared. Duncan said he can remember working on that bunker and changing the green design. And I just think it was early on when he started his career. I can't remember when that was now. It would have been around, in that sort of late 80s period. I should think there's a few of you that can remember that happening. So again, it's another hole that's really been subject to a lot of change, and not so much in the last 30 years perhaps. Going on to the 14th, I'll just get a quote later on. Bernard Darwin wrote, I'll have to take a step forward, so I can't read it from that angle. I can read it from here. One of the best holes in the course with the green well guarded by typical Mackenzie bunkers, not easy to describe but easy to recognise, is what he wrote. And this is a time when Mackenzie was sort of in his absolute pomp. He was doing, he was just being commissioned to do Cypress Point. He was about to go out to Australia and design Royal Melbourne and so on. And he was really gathering momentum, and it was probably, along with Harry Colt, the two of them were probably the two leading architects in the world at that time. But what Darwin also went on to write about was that you're asked to drive out to the left-hand side. The hole was about width, and the further out that you went, the more you were able to play down the length of the green. If you drove too far, you'd have to come in over the outer bounds. And that's why the green was sort of lined with the right-hand side was lined with the bunkers that I mentioned earlier on. And then you start to see trees growing up. There's a couple of copses there, and then the trees really start to establish. And with the tree growth there, the feeling of width in the 14th was lost, and then the bunkers start to alter as well. And you can really see that the character of the whole changes very significantly. And I mentioned about the artistic license. I've got no explanation as to whether those bunkers were there, ever built, whether they were part of the artistic license in the 1926 plans. It's one of the unknowns that we may get to the bottom of it, but in the work that we've done so far, I really don't know. There is one bunker on the left-hand side, which is possibly that one. But again, that is really to form the channel so that if you get yourself into the right position, and it's either off the tee or with your second shot or your third shot or your fourth shot, if you can get yourself on that line, then you've got the bonus of playing down the length of the green. And that's something that Alistair Mackenzie was really keen on doing. You're trying to get people to think, to work out where the best lines were, and to site bunkers so that they sort of drove you a little bit mad trying to get into the right position. So that was the photograph that I showed you earlier. There's the front bunker, and the bunker's just continued right the way up that right side of the green. And you're being asked to drive into this position in order to play right up the length of the green. But I think you probably all know now that that sort of feeling of width and different options has really been lost by the planting over the years. That's the bunker. I think it was two bunkers, wasn't it? The old plan shows that. And the bunker continues on. Those people are on the other side of the bunker. So really that whole right side of the bunker was lined by the sand. So if you missed the green to the right, it was one of those pitches back up onto the green. This again is, I know explanation. So this was 1926. We know from the receipt that David uncovered that Mackenzie was doing work in 1926. So we can only, and the photograph from 1931 in the handbook bears no resemblance to that. It's fantasy land. So I can only think that it was somebody saying, well, we don't really know what's happening, we'll just make a bit of a guess at it. And that's why it's so different. But interestingly, by 1948, the really major changes to the whole. The two high left bunkers have disappeared. There was two bunkers on the left, which now have become a really long, narrow sort of sausage-like shape, and the two bunkers on the right are largely unaltered. So the second bunker on the right started to disappear, and I would sort of venture a guess that disappeared because it's such a big slope that the sand kept washing off the slope, and it was very hard to maintain. The approach bunker is still there, but by 1989 the approach bunker on the left has disappeared. So really a major alterations to a hole which we know is an original Mackenzie hole. So just as a reminder of what it was with the three bunkers in there. I think the approach bunker may have just been out of shot in the bottom left-hand corner. And then the three bunkers on the left of the green, and then the two perched up on the hill. And again, I would suggest that the left bunkers up on the hill were filled in because of the impracticality of trying to keep sand on the slopes. So the next step that we do is to put together a timeline. I'm certainly not going to go into that, but it's just trying to clarify what happened when, partly as a record for the club and also just to help us to get it into our heads. And the reason I put it in also was that we're sort of looking at when he was commissioned to do other work as well. And it was something that was in the request for proposal that was highlighting that there was a sort of a contemporary nature of the work here and the work that was being done out on the sandbelt in Melbourne. Just say it's hard to deny that there's a real sort of similarity in styles between those two. And it's also impossible to deny that very soon after that things were being altered pretty heavily, and that nowadays the whole it's recognizable but only just as being of that sort of caliber. So just sort of ask you to store that away and bring it up again in a second. So what is the value of the information that we've found then? One is that Ilkley's always sought the advice from really top architects. It's not always followed it, but it's always asked it. These many in the 20s, the people that were advising you were really the greats. They weren't just great then, but they remain great names now, particularly Colton Mackenzie. Knowing that Mackenzie did so much work here is a really a great attribute for a club to have. And we've also, I think, proven without any doubt that from what Darwin wrote very specifically, that the 13th, 14th and 15th were designed by him. But when I look at the 12th, I would suggest that certainly seems to bear similar hallmarks in terms of the setup of the green and the bunkering and so on. So I think that's an interesting insight, and it's also interesting that he'd been a member at Ilkley earlier on in the century, and that he lived not far away, and that he was actually coming into the club to look at work that was going on, almost while he was packing his bags to go off to Australia and to go out to Cypress Point and so on. So he obviously had a bit of a soft spot for Ilkley, which I think just adds a bit of richness to the story. I think it's fair to say that perhaps that influence hasn't always been appreciated as much as it could have been. And I think I hope that seeing some of those old photographs gives a little bit of a drive or direction at least in how to inform further work on the course, because it does give us a really good insight on the work that Mackenzie did, along with the descriptions of Bernard Darwin, as I mentioned.